Hi, and welcome to the second of a series of events on comics on transnational themes as part of Arts Multilingual Week. I'm thrilled to be welcoming an Icelandic scholar who's talking about a genre of comic art that I know very little about, so I'm absolutely thrilled that you're here to share your knowledge with us. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that we're gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Beyond the work that we're doing in Arts Multilingual Week to draw attention to transnational comics, this programming is also part of another event taking place tomorrow, a documentary on an Icelandic women's movement entitled The Day Iceland Stood Still, which we're screening at the Norm at 7 p.m. 6:30 p.m. And so I'm really grateful to Sydney Lyons in particular, who helped put all of this programming together to help us have these conversations about Icelandic feminism and also the role of comics in Romani activism and artistic production. Our speaker today is Sofiya Zahova, who is the director of the Vijdas International Center for Multilingualism and Intercultural Understanding, a UNESCO Category 2 center at the University of Iceland. Her key academic fields are Romani studies, cultural studies, and Eastern European studies. Sofiya's interdisciplinary research has been focused on the interrelationship between identity politics, writing and knowledge production, minority issues, and community identity from historical and contemporary perspectives. These inquiries explore the experiences and perspectives of Romani people in the global context, minorities and ethnicity in the post-Yugoslav context, as well as Indigenous peoples and minorities in the Nordic region. Currently, she leads the research project. There's a capital I, so I'm wondering, could you, Romis?
Yes.
Okay. Romis, History and Ethnography of Roma in Iceland and Romani Educational Material in a Nordic Context. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please, we look forward to your presentation and the Q&A at its conclusion.
Thank you so much, Bis, for this introduction. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Sydney and Bis, for your hospitality and taking care of me and the Icelandic group. And I'm really pleased to be here and sharing my knowledge with you and my research. And since I've been told maybe the audience will not have any prior knowledge to Romani literature, I would start with very basic things. And also I would like to tell you that anytime you wanna come with a question, just raise your hand or just ask for clarification or something like this. So we try to be more interactive, but my plan, okay, shall I share my slides on Zoom? So I'll just talk generally about the Roman literature and publishing practices. We see that. Okay. So then I will talk about actually the birth of the Romani strip that is closely interconnected with the birth of Romani literature in general that happened in the Soviet Union in the interwar period. And I will really pay attention to that because I know we are in an East European studies environment also, so you might already have some context. And then I will move into common themes in Romani literature that we observe across different genres, but in particular also in comics and graphic narratives. And I should say that even though the number of Romani authored books is rising in the last decade and actually has been existing since the beginning of the 20th century, actually we don't have many comics or graphic novels that are authored or co-authored by Roma. And my understanding of Romani literature, to put it very shortly, because you can imagine this is a great discussions are going on in the field of studies of Romani literature, is publications authored or co-authored by Roma and directed towards Romani audiences among others, and in the Romani language as well sometimes, but not always. Also, my take on Romani literature has been for many years more historiographical, so to say. So I've been trying to look at writing practices back in history, trying to prove that actually, unlike the common perception on Romani literature, that is that Romani literature has existed in oral form for many centuries and has been appearing only in the 1960s. Actually, I tried to prove through my research on writing practices, published materials, and manuscripts that actually Roma have been trying to write since the mid-19th century and trying to publish, but the environment was not that welcoming. And it became more welcoming. So we have in the 19th century, the first publications by Roma. If you would be curious, I have slides on that as well, just very shortly. Then actually, as I said, the birth of fictional writing is usually dated in the interwar period in the Soviet Union, when we have a fully fledged development literary scene with books produced in the Romani language by Roma, from novelettes to as we will see, comic strips. But then in the second half of the 20th century, we have publications in all countries where Roma live, actually. So, and the circumstances become more or less favorable in a way, because many countries develop certain policies that stimulate minorities, including the Roma. And this, of course, is closely entangled with the general discourse on human rights, minority rights that we are observing since the 1960s. And then in the new millennium, you have really a lot of international developments that allow us to speak about Romani literary scene as a joint phenomenon. So you would have writers' unions, we will have festivals that are actually of global and international nature, which doesn't, of course, overshadows the national development of Romani literature. I'm not talking just here exemplify everything, but this is, for instance, a periodical from Finland that was published in the early 20th century, in the time where actually the first Romani theater was established, also by Finnish Roma woman, by the way. So, and the context that I would like to highlight is that Roma communities have always been multilingual. So and that's very common for all kinds of minorities. Many communities, though, have lost their language, Romani language, due to very oppressive policies. Nevertheless, compared to other communities that have been exposed to language oppression, Romani is very vital. And I've been asked by colleagues, linguists, why, what would be the reason? Because if we look at, the rules for, how the language can be kept, none of these conditions exist for the Romani community. Then Romani writing, actually text in the Romani language exists in the 16th century, when we have translations of Bible, the Lord Prayer, this kind of religious text. And this is actually a pattern that we observe in the European context across different writing traditions. So recordings of texts that would be of religious nature. And then when we look at the figure of the Romani writer, editor, and publisher, it's actually sort of coincides and overlaps with the figure of the Romani activist. So very often the writers, and this is again not unique for Roma, but for many communities that are striving to achieve rights and justice for those belonging to the community. So usually those who produce and write Romani books would be activists, politicians, researchers, educators. So they would have many, many hats. And many educated Roma, even if they have different background, like political sciences, and so on. They would contribute through writing, be in periodical publications or as authors of fictional works. And this is something which we can relate to many other minority communities. May I ask how many of you have met Roma people? People of Roma background? And how many of you have idea what a Roma person or a gypsy is? Oh, I'm sure that this rings bells to many in many heads. And how many have met Czech people, people of Czech background? And how many have idea about Czech people when they hear it? Like what do Czechs look like or any stereotypes? Yeah. Yes, usually I ask this question to students just to show that even though we don't have personally encountered people of Romani background, certainly there is an idea, an image or imaginary that comes to our heads with the word gypsy or Roma or traveler. Which is not the case with communities that usually are not stereotyped. Of course, Czechs are stereotyped by their Slovak neighbors, not necessarily maybe in positive sense, but certainly the Romani community that is an ethnic community. It has origin from northern India, has been living in the European continent since the early Middle Ages. So this is actually existing ethnic community, but there are a lot of images that exist in fiction, art, or public discourse that actually affect how people perceive the Roma, even though they have never met members of this ethnic community. And Roma are not unique, but it is very typical for the Western and generally the European culture to have a certain image of the Roma since the Middle Ages. And this image has been, we always talk about these two sides of the coin that go together. One is the exotic, free-spirited, dancing, playing gypsy, the seductive Romani women, and so on the one hand, and on the other, the extreme poverty and deprived conditions of living. But they are essentially tightly linked together. And the image of the Roma is never related to what lay person would do in their day life, like be working pizza delivery, which many Roma who work in Iceland do, for instance, or be teachers or educators or this kind of things. And actually, the majority of Roma have these professions and live lay way of life that is comparable to the other members of the society in which they live. Actually, I'm not going to elaborate on this because it's a very complex thing that is not necessarily serving the aims of today's talk. But basically, what I'm working on now, this is part of a manuscript that's forthcoming next year in Brill about the invisibility of Romani literature. So basically, my claim is that because Roma are perceived as so exotic and unable to write, that people think Romani literature is impossible, and not only people, but researchers of Romani literature. So I use very much inspired by the use of discourse by Michel Foucault. I use the prevailing social discourse on Roma as an interpreting framework for the fact that many literary works by Roma are not seen as literary works by people of Romani background, but in another way. And this has been happening because even when we have published works that are fairly well known, and especially this one published in Norway, it has several editions. So it was actually the first memoir written by a Roma person that we know of. Published towards the end of the 19th century, a memoir, and then some religious text in Rezan de Romani, that was his own dialect. And then we have here some plays that were written by another Roma person, and these works have been published. But despite the fact that these things exist and are digitized, so this can be downloaded on the internet, many researchers of Romani literature would say that no works were produced until the 1960s or 1950s. Simply because we think that this community is so related to orality and non-writing practices that we don't actually see, even as researchers, the existence of these writing practices. So this is something that sort of a context that I wanted to provide, and invite you if you have any questions to this, so far, because we are moving more to showing the strips and graphic novels. Okay, so as I mentioned several times, the birth of Romani literature and fictional works by Roma authors is very much related to the interwar period in Soviet Union. And we have to say that actually this was not something that the Soviet policymakers decided they would address Roma. This was a general policy towards communities that have been considered oppressed by previous regimes that had to be sort of developed through support for their writing tradition, education, schools, and whole system of support for these communities. So this is the context. These were not specifically Roma-related policies, but of course, Roma were part of the communities that were addressed by them. And then we have a big number of titles that were produced by Roma in the Romani language using the Cyrillic script. And actually, illustrations were very richly used in this production because, of course, the state for about a decade really supported this work through editorial work, translations. All major and mainstream publishing houses were actually working on this project also, so they were publishing this literature. It was not. It was part of the publishing practices of the state, so to say. And it's very impressive because if you think it's a decade and this number of titles were produced, it's really industrious, very industrious phenomenon in a way. Just to give you an idea of the graphics that were used, many illustrations that were primarily done not by Roma. So the texts were very often authored by Roma, translated by Roma, or by linguists who were working with them. But the illustrations were done, let's say, maybe by the illustrators who were working for this mainstream publishing house where the work was published. Educational materials, of course, were part of the whole context. And here is Maria Poliakova, who was, there were few women who were part of the Romani Writers Group and Romani Union as a whole. So they were active contributors to writing periodicals, educational materials, and Romani fiction. So this was sort of their job. It was their profession. And Maria Poliakova is the author of the first Romani strip to appear on the pages of the journal Romani Zoria, which means Romani Down. So the issue number 2 from 1929 and issues number 3 and 4 from the next year were containing one page of this strip that was actually, the story was written by Maria Poliakova, the Romani author. We don't know who the illustrator was, but it was probably someone who was working for the periodical or the publishing house. And how did this look like? So actually we have these boards and actually when you look at the pages, you think that it's not really clearly the illustration. You have the feeling it was made to be, it was meant to be on a broader format, not the format of A4 that we have of this journal. And actually a colleague, Victor Shapoval, who is working with the archives of Romani publications of this period, he found actually a template for much larger board. And he thinks that the idea was that this was also distributed as a poster for different institutions where Roma should be educated. And generally, the format very much resembles an earlier format used in the Russian Empire called Lubok. So basically, these were first illustrations that were on boards to sort of educate the lay people. So there was a message communicated through visuals. So there was no text at the beginning. Later, when the literacy rates were rising in the 19th century, then there were four-line rhymes that were accompanying this text. And actually, you can clearly see how this strip was inspired in a way by this old tradition of Lubok that was actually declining already at the beginning of the 20th century. And the story is actually very similar to the pattern that we see in all fiction works by Roma author of the time. So it's very much propaganda in it. Roma live a nomadic way of life. It's not good. It's not good for them. They have to have proper job. They have to have proper houses. So then they are sort of enlightened by the new regime that provides for them. So they have to live like Soviet citizens, contribute to society, have regular job, and so on. And the story is, and the rhymes are in Romani, in Cyrillic, that was the standard for the time. The story is the Rom Pupirka, that was his name, is having troubles. So the family lives very poor, they all are hungry, and so on. They can't make a living, he is mistreated. And at the end of the story, he's just very suffering and depressed in a way. And he receives a copy of Romani Zoria, the very journal that publishes the strips. And this is the end of the story. Then in the next issue, we learn that actually following the information that he received from the journal itself, he goes to Moscow, where he meets the so-called Moscow Roma that would be part of the activists of the time. So he meets these people that are nicely dressed and very supportive. They lead him to the Romani Union. They show him Roma that are educated. They show him Roma that work in factory. And actually, he adopts this new way of life. So you see, this is the kind of propaganda pattern that is unique, not unique for Romani literature, but for generally the literature of the time. Unfortunately, there is no sequence of this. So these are the only two pages of the story that we have. And we don't know if there was an idea to have, more of them or not. But nevertheless, we don't know of more. We only know that probably there was a plan to have this published on a larger format poster to be distributed across the country. And then moving already, this is the only strip we know of before the Second World War. And then moving in the second half of the 20th century, as I already mentioned, graphic novels or comic strips were not genre favored by Roma authors who were mostly into poetry or short story, novelettes or novels, and so on. And I myself, as a researcher, if someone asked me if I didn't have any prior knowledge about the archival material and what has been published, I would speculate that because Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, was a country where the strip culture, and by strip in Yugoslav context, we mean all kinds of things, both this kind of strip stories, graphic novels, so everything is in this, all comics and graphic novels works. I would speculate that there would be Roma who would write or create strips because it was very popular in Yugoslavia in the 70s and the 1980s. So there was a very rich culture of producing comic strips at that time. However, we don't have examples of such strips, and actually we know only of one strip to which a Roma person contributed to, but it was not directed to Romani audiences and it was not on a Romani topic. So, but just to provide you a context, we do have strips. This is from 1944, produced by Andrija Muratović, who was called the father of Croatian strip. So he was a very fundamental creator. This is a very, very stereotypical narrative that we encounter in non-Romani culture and literature about the Roma. So this is a popular folk tale that tells about a gypsy who is a cunning character, and he cheats, and that's how he manages to get golden coins. This kind of representation, of course, does exist in popular culture, as we know, richly. But this is just the other side of the non-Roma image of the Roma that we have observed. But when it comes to the Roma contribution to the Yugoslav strip, this is Luan Koko, originally from Kosovo. I couldn't find a picture from the 1980s, so I had to use this one. So he actually wrote a few stories, actually 3 strips. He was co-author of 3 strips produced in the mainstream, most famous and, very influential magazine called U-Strip magazine. So, they were published in mid-1980s. And one of the story is Vorlog, and the other is Not Even Dreams of Power and Other Stories. So in Vorlog, that was a kind of really influential story, and I think many people who were into this culture would know it. It's actually the story of a scholar who is engaged with indigenous communities in Latin America, and he misuses the knowledge that he receives and then is punished by this. So there is a lot of things going on around this story. So when I interviewed Luan Koko, who currently lives in Belgrade, he actually, and I asked him, does it matter that you had Romani background when you were a co-author of this story? He actually says that the stories of the indigenous communities and the story of Romani communities, he thinks, are very closely related, and there are common patterns, of course, of mistreatment on behalf of the society, and also sort of this kind of community knowledge. So he believes that his background, of course, had influenced his creativity when creating the story without having anything to do with a Romani topic at that time. And he is currently, as other authors of Romani literature today, for instance, he is engaged in education, activism, and political action. And that's basically the only record of any contribution of a person of Romani background that I know of from the Yugoslav time. And in this time in Yugoslavia, actually, there were special policies supporting the creation of Romani literature. So there were translations of mainstream literature into Romani language. There were poetry works. There were periodical publications run by Roma editorial team, but no narratives of this type in this genre were created by Roma at that time. And now moving towards the era of 1990s, just few remarks about the context. So this is the period after the fall of communism, when there is a rise of the Roma issue. So many governments are trying to address the question of the rights of the Roma. Many Romani activists organize, self-organize in parties, in non-governmental organizations. So there are a lot of activities going on since the 1990s. And then, of course, there are more mobilities, Roma meeting at different forums. So there is a lot of transnational movement, Romani movement. that would be a movement of Romani activists / authors as well. And when we look at the literary scene, there are like many features that allow us to talk about transnational and international developments. There are joint anthologies, there are translations, there are festivals, there are awards, there are unions of Romani authors across many countries. So there is this kind of a forming of a space where Roma authors express internationally and address international audience. And then also in this period, we have the shaping of several narratives that we see across genres in Romani literature. One of them is actually the theme of embedding Romani history into certain kind of literary production. And I've been writing on this and reflecting on the fact that actually when there is a lack of a sort of standardized history of Roma that is communicated through the educational system, of course, Roma do need a space to express and to communicate their own view about the Romani history. And this is what we see across genres in Romani literature, including through comics and graphic narratives. In one of the earliest Romani periodicals in the Czech Republic, this is Romano Curco or Romani Weekly, if we have to translate, there is actually a page where Romani history is communicated and on the base of really serious scholarly work. So these are not narratives that are a sort of born out of the creative imagination, but really based on scholarly books produced by Romani scholars. And not only in periodicals, even though in periodicals it's much easier to do that simply because they are already running, so you don't have to fundraise for a special book and so on. But also we do see very finely done like comics and stories created on the base of, again, books on Romani history. And this one, so this is the translation. So drom in Romani means path or way. So it is very finely done and published in the Czech Republic. So the language is Czech. So it addresses both Roma and non-Roma audiences if you start interpreting this. There are two characters, a Romani girl and a Czech boy, who actually travel through space and time and visit 8 places that are of key importance for the Romani history in general, like the exodus from India, or for the Roma in the Czech Republic. So they appear to be in places that are important from Romani history, and Romani historical narratives are embedded in their adventures, so to say. And the book is based on the work of 2 scholars. One is Milena Hubschmanova, who is the founder of Romani studies in the Czech Republic, in the Charles University, and Jana Horvatova, who himself is a Romani historian. So these books served as the fundament for writing the story of the publication that had a second edition in 2010. And a very similar publication in terms of narrating the history of the Roma with this kind of standardized important elements of the Romani history was produced in Poland. And you can see also the title is again Drom, that is paths or ways. And it again narrates the Romani history since the early Middle Ages, how Roma were traveling, how Roma were in the Byzantine Empire, about their crafts, about their treatment and mistreatment by the majority society as well. So this kind of, yes,
Sorry, I was just wondering for this
Yes.
one and for the last one,
Yes.
were the illustrators also Romani?
No, they were not.
Okay.
In these cases, no. So actually, these books, these creators, they use actually the stories that are written by Roma historians, but they themselves, the ones who transform them into a comics story, are not. Yes.
Okay.
But both they and the other team, they work closely also with Roma editors, so to say. So they get this reviewed by Roma academics or linguists who would provide feedback on this. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then another theme that is a core theme in both Romani activism and Roma international movement since its early history is the topic of the Romani Holocaust and persecution of the Roma during, before and during the Second World War. And this is really a core topic. Of course, it's a community trauma, and many researchers would write about it, that in the lack of really standardized history of many communities who live across the globe and have different religions, maybe different languages and different community practices, still the history of being persecuted is something that is can unite these communities. And of course, this traumatic experience was something that happened to many Romani communities. Some were spared, so to say, but this was the experience through which many Roma have lived. And unfortunately, recognition for the genocide of the Roma was received much later than other communities who were persecuted. What I'm showing here is three women who were actually the first authors to narrate in writing about the persecution of their own communities. And this is not on gender, our talk here, but I also write about it, how actually, despite this general discourse, how oppressed the Roma women are and so on, actually, Roma women are very often the first to write on a key topic, especially when it comes to commemorating important events. And for instance, Charles Stoiker, she was quite discouraged by her own family to go public about their stories. She survived Auschwitz-Birkenau at a very early age. And of course, for many communities, because of the shame and trauma, it was very problematic to go public and write about it. Nevertheless, they did it. And these two women were the first to write in German language about it. And you know that in the German-speaking context, of course, the Holocaust has also a central place when it comes to historical experiences of persecution or being persecuted. But in fact, Papusha or Branislava Weitz, a Polish Roma woman who was not in the camps, but her community was persecuted in woods and in areas of what was then occupied territories. So basically, she wrote in the 1950s her memories in a long poem called Tears of Blood, in which she narrates about the persecution of both Roma and Jews that she witnessed. However, the full account, the full poem was published only recently, and the book is open access, and there is a regional and an English translation of the one if you are curious to learn more about it. So the narrative about the Holocaust as a community trauma and a community historical central event takes also a great part in the production of Romani graphic narratives. Probably the most famous, and I have bought two of them, two books that I would leave for your library and archives. This is the English translation of the graphic narrative about
the experience of Sofiya Zahova. So she was born, a Roma girl, born into a Polish Roma family, who survived the camps as the only survivor from her family was rescued by the so-called Red Cross buses to Sweden, and then where she actually was taken care of by a Roma community that had nothing to do with her family, but because she was Roma, she was invited to join them, later married. And she kept this secret for many, many years, for decades. And at a very old age, she asked Gunilla Lundgren, who is a very famous children's literature author and Romani literature author without being of a Romani background. She co-writes with Roma. So this book is actually a result of years of interviews and conversations between Gunilla and Sofiya, where Gunilla wrote the story that Sofiya revised, denied, and revised it. So it was a really, and it said that Sofiya didn't see the book being published actually. So she passed away. But actually, at the end of her life, even though she was effectively hiding the sign about which all of her grandchildren were asking, she decided to tell the story and to be public and open about it. So it's a very fine book that is translated into, luckily now, many languages, including several dialects of the Romani language. And the authors kindly offer to those who are interested to translate in other languages. So it's being translated into German, it's translated, of course, into Norwegian, French, and so on. But if you are interested, they provide the copyrights and they provide the whole publishing file in which only the bubbles can be filled with translation for free. So I tell it often, and thanks to this kind of talks, the German translation appeared, for instance, and the Czech one. So just to let you know about this, it's been very educational to distribute the book, and Gunilla is also going to different events, speaking about it and keeping the memory of Sofiya. Yes, Brynjar?
Icelandic translation.
No, there is no. Yeah, I was trying to hook colleagues to do it.
Yes, but we should correct that. And also, there are funds that are provided by Finnish government to translate Finnish literature. So also this could be, obviously it's not a commercial project, but this can support the translating process or the printing costs. Another example of such a book, even though there was a discussion whether this is shall we call it a comics or it's just a picture book, but there is a colleague, a Polish scholar has written an article about it, claiming that we should treat this as a comics because the graphics and the text have equal importance and the sequence reminds of the comics logic. So to say, I don't feel an expert to say it, but I certainly want to mention this publication because it's actually very depersonalized. So this is a story of a Roma boy that is written from his perspective, from the child's perspective. So he is destined to die, being encamped with his family in the Nazi camps, but he is a child. So he narrates from this perspective, and it's a very, very fine book produced in Polish language. And also in the earlier shown comics from Poland, actually, we also have the narrative about the Holocaust that is being shown. Yes, and then the last point, the last theme that I would like to highlight is narratives about the self, broadly speaking. And very often we would read from scholars who write on Roman literature that because Roman literature is so young, in a way and not so complex. It's self-referential. So there is a lot of talk about as the Roma or personality that is Roma. Well, in fact, we have a lot of themes that are not necessarily based on biographies or testimonials, but actually the Roma, because of the status of the Romani community that is still to be improved to really reach equality, actually many Roma write on Romani topics, not because they're obsessed with self-referentiality, but because it's important to create stories that encounter richly observed stereotypes about Roma in mainstream literature and culture, including in comics production. And therefore, it is important to always come with your face and with your own story and say, here I am, and this is my story, and this is not what you think about the Roma. And many Roma have been doing that. So telling their story in a very fine way, in different way. One would be semi-autobiographical, children's literature, others would be novels, essays, or like multi-genre publications or picture books about children. And one of the authors that I would like to highlight from Nordic, the other author from the Nordic context, that's the Finnish Roma author Kiva Lundberg, who is more famous as a painter, as an artist, but she is also an author of at least 3 books based on her autobiographical experience, and also of the comics called Diary of a Mad Artist. Actually, her notes on her life and her reflections when she was preparing her exhibition for the Viennese Biennale. But it's for the diary, but it actually not exactly a diary. It's a publication that I think it's really important to highlight because both actually she initially wrote this called Gypsy Comics. Actually, this is a collection of works that she has created for one of the mainstream Finnish journals, but then this was collected later and published in a book. But the one that I think I would like to highlight here is the Diary of the Mad Artist. And this would be, again, left for your library if you're interested, because it's also in English. And she has written in Finnish. It was translated in English. And she talks about, of course, her life, reflects on her own identity, on her traumas, and it's a very interesting piece of work that I highly recommend. And the last was almost the last that I want to highlight. It's because there are some researchers here, and hopefully more will be joining the Researchers Club. There is this very fine book that was published in the Czech Republic by colleagues who actually are Romani study scholars, and they decided to transform their field notes into comic stories about 3 Roma personalities that were their key collaborators. And it's very interesting work, because they reflect, they're anthropologists, and they reflect on this, and it's been based on their field notes. And just the last thing, we still have periodicals as a platform for publishing strips or graphic stories, including created by Roma, including some based on testimonials by Roma, like the persecution of Roma in Kosovo, or famous Romani authors who has written other piece as a short story, but it was transformed in this form, in a comics form, for more popular audience, so to say, to popularize her work. And this is the final point. I would like to encourage you to be in touch. I haven't done a slide with the references, but could send you references and could send you an article on which part of this talk was based, also if you're interested. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you much, Steph.